theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. That's right. Interviews with theologians, biblical scholars, philosophers, and today, a sociologist of religion. That's right. Gerardo Marti is on the podcast. He is a professor of sociology at Davidson in North Carolina. And he is not only a leader in the field of sociology of religion, but he is tons of fun. He's spent quite a bit of time in his career looking at multi-ethnic churches, the nature of faith and spirituality in Southern California and Los Angeles. He did an extensive study on the emerging church movement and the Glass Cathedral, Robert Schuller and such, and has recently published American Blindspot, Race, Class, Religion in the Trump Presidency. It is an amazing book, like full endorsement, like so good that when I read it, I was like, oh, I was wrong about this. This is really helpful. Gerardo, you're awesome. And in this conversation, we not only talk about American Blindspot, current shape of American religion, politics, spirituality, but he also gives us some insight as to just what a sociologist of religion does. What are the kinds of questions and research projects and things that drive that particular field? So you'll hear about him, you hear about the field, his career, and then we'll get into a number of different research projects and things he's on. But it was just tons of fun. Before we jump in, I want to let you all know that right now, Homebrewed Christianity has not one, but two big book giveaways going on. We're giving away like all of Catherine Keller, legendary feminist process theologian, all of her books as part of a celebration of her upcoming book, Facing the Apocalypse. It's coming out. You can win a copy of that. The grand prize winner is going to win like over $500 worth of her books. Also, we're doing a book giveaway titled Religion in a Secular Age. This giveaway includes a whole bunch of Charles Taylor, Hartmut Rosa, two philosophers of culture, and friend of the podcast, the one and only Andrew Root. That's right. This big book giveaway is not only going to be celebrating the publication of his trilogy, engaging Rosa and Taylor and thinking about it for ministry and the shape of faith today, but it's also in anticipation of an upcoming Homebrewed Christianity class, Religion in the Spiritual Crisis, Ministry in a Secular Age. A number of Homebrewed members, people that went to homebrewedcommunity.com, have said, Trip, we'd love for you to do an online reading group that focuses on the questions community leaders, faith leaders are asking. And I said, yeah, but we normally do super nerdy things. And then I said to myself, I'm friends with one of the most super nerds of all time, Andrew Root. He also is a practical theologian. He has a series on Charles Taylor, Hartmut Rosa, and I love Taylor like a lot. So I said, hey, Andy, you want to do this? And he was like, yes, I want to do this. So that's what we're going to do. Anyone and everyone can join the class. You'll have fun reading these big thinkers, but we're going to try to gear a lot of the questions and in the shape of what we're doing to the questions and challenges faith leaders are voicing. So yeah, go check out the giveaway. You can go sign up for the class at oursecularage.com. It's this summer, so don't worry. It's this summer, but we just set everything up. Want to let you all know about it. All right. Now, get ready. Gerardo is here to bring the sociological investigation of American religion hype. Enjoy. All right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Gerardo, sociologist and scholar of religion. And he's got a new book, American Blindspot. It's not about over intense joy for baseball. It's about well, where Donald Trump came from. I was also published on the emerging church movement, on the role of Hollywood at influencing evangelical life, the Crystal Cathedral. But most of all, he's a friendly interlocutor on the interwebs who's finally enjoying the podcast. So hopefully I'm not going to ruin this, Gerardo.
No, I'm sure it'll be great. Thanks so much for having me.
So maybe the place to begin is for you to tell your origin story. Like, what has to happen for you to end up at USC doing a PhD studying sociology and religion?
Well, I was so excited to go to college, and yet I always thought that college was to help me get a job. So I was always envisioning myself as having a white collar job in one of the downtown corporate offices in Los Angeles. That was my goal. And in the part of going through school, I discovered that I really enjoyed theory. I really enjoyed things that I was helping me to give insight into how the world worked. And so I ended up finding my way into sociology and double majored. And it was in my senior year that my professor said, they'll give you money to go to graduate school and get a doctorate.
Oh.
I'd never heard of that. So I went ahead and I applied to the only schools I knew, which were all in California. And I was accepted at 3 schools. 2 of them gave me money. And of the 2, I thought USC was the better school. And enjoyed my time very much there because it was a completely free moment to think, read, study. And I had no debt, no burdens to really be concerned about. And so I was just able to really dig in. At the same time, I'm a Christian. I had a faith commitment that came from a radical conversion when I was in middle school, and I never lost that. And so always there was the issue of how do you relate to what's going on in the local church, caring about ministry and what's going on there, and all of the really exciting things that I was learning in sociology about power and the construction of reality and this fluid self and all those kinds of things. And so that sort of relationship between what was going on in the church, which was, of course, very active in Southern California, birthplace of Pentecostalism, birthplace of Campus Crusade, birthplace of some of the major developments in megachurches. That's kind of the place that I sort of fell into. So eventually, and this is now many years later, I eventually circled back to doing a dissertation on multiracial churches, and went through a case study of Mosaic in Los Angeles. Some people may know Mosaic, Erwin McManus, who encouraged me to do it and to finish. And I was on staff at Mosaic at the time. So I was able to do an ethnography, and that built onto what became a big sort of move into scholarship, because the things that I knew, the things that I understood, the things that didn't have to be explained to me were very new to the broader community of sociologists of religion. Most sociologists of religion came from the East Coast or the South. Most of them understood denominations. Most of them had been absorbed in very long denominational histories. And here I was thinking about Pentecostalism, social change, the way in which, large churches operated, the sort of involvement of young adults, and the attempt to really energize relevant ministry among younger people. And so all of those things were like my backyard.
Yeah.
So I had to learn about adjudicatories and things like that. But I just ended up really falling into a really exciting relationship with scholars of religion in America. And then that became international. And I had already been teaching college classes part-time as I was sort of completing my dissertation, even when I thought I may never finish it. And that's why eventually, when I completed my dissertation and it was in press at Indiana University Press, I found myself on the job market, and Davidson College, in an unusual moment, had an open spot. And out of all the places that I applied to and the places that I interviewed at, Davidson was just a wonderful fit. So that's where I'm at. Davidson College, just north of Charlotte, which you know.
Oh, yeah. And Douglas Otati, who's been on the podcast recently, is on faculty there as well, if people are listening. And I had a number of former youth go to Davidson and really enjoyed the experience there. Yeah. So I grew up in the South, but then spent 10 years in Los Angeles. And I love Los Angeles and it's all of its weirdness. But it took me 3 or 4 years to even make sense of it is like the most religiously spiritual place without any of the inertia from things you get on the East Coast or things you get from the South. Like, how would you describe it having gone the other direction from Southern California to North Carolina? What were like the biggest differences if you're trying to help people on the East Coast get a glimpse of the, I don't know, the I wouldn't say creativity, but it's like a different type of impulse or energy behind religion.
Yeah, it's got a different vibe. I think when people think of the Jesus people and hippies and looking at the clash of people who thought that Jesus was groovy versus the, tight collared sort of people who believed that the Bible was absolutely true and you needed to learn it in a particular way. Southern California was a place when those things mixed together, because California was also the birthplace of contemporary Christian music. And I went to free concerts every Saturday night at Calvary Chapel. And so I was at the center of that. In fact, not a lot of people know this, but I was actually a booking agent for some of the Christian bands and Christian highlights, including some people from the former Sweet Comfort band.
Oh, yeah.
Band? Yeah, I used to be a booking agent for them. So that and Melodyland and other places. So basically what I think you have is, first of all, you have a free-spirited, informal, more entrepreneurial sense of what religion is. We are, they would say, look, we're just trying to follow the Spirit, man. We're just trying to hear what God's trying to say. And they still accepted that the Bible was true. So having a Bible, reading it faithfully, praying faithfully was important. And they did believe in the church. You should be with people. You should be encouraging each other. You should be challenging each other. Discipleship is important. But they threw away the idea that you had to follow rules, that there was a sense of reading particular scriptures at particular times, or that the liturgy was set in a particular way, or that the people who were up front were to be people that you had immense respect for just because they had a title rather than the force of their message or the relationship that you had from them. So there was a more vital sense of the activity of charismatic authority, if we put it in sociological terms, because people attracted mass audiences, but it is because these people had a very endearing or charming, powerful, provocative, a mixture of those way of being able to present spiritual truth in ways that people resonated with and made it applicable to their lives. And the aging downward was important. So it was appealing to people in their 20s, not so much people in their 50s, and to survive, I think, make money, enough money on the basis of being able to attract a younger audience, I think was also part of the trick. And we saw a lot more merging between parachurch organizations and local churches. And all of this is explained. Now I have a much better view of all these things from people like Darren Dochuk from Bible Belt to Sun Belt's an excellent book, or Donald Miller's Reinventing American Protestantism, which is a fantastic book. And then I would put my work in that mix, is to try to kind of come to terms with how is it that religion is working today and what creates new forms of vitality for the moment. And yet, now that I'm this far along, you mentioned American Blindspot, to see what was the logic of really largely white evangelicalism and what was built into that has led us to the political attitudes that people take today and the kind of very narrow-minded anti-pluralism, high stakes on things like abortion, gender, sexuality, and the grab for power that came to an enthusiasm for the Trump presidency. That's a whole different sort of thing that has come about that I would not have seen when I started or when I was growing up. But certainly I can trace the seeds of that even now. So.
Oh yeah, no, it's really fascinating. And one of the things that struck me when I went back to North Carolina for a couple of years after being in Los Angeles are the things that I would say and do that would get applause from a very large UCC church in Los Angeles. And the things I would all sorts of things, all of a sudden became allergic to and people really like it. But then but you're not going to say, you're not going to do, or whatever. And, I worked at a UCC church in Palos Verdes Estates, and rather quickly, if you're a gifted minister in Southern California, they don't have lots of people that want just to hang out with their minister, right? Mm-hmm. So if you get good at your job, you start to have more freedom. And our staff, the whole goal was, once you free up time, do new things. So I start doing the podcast once a month at a brewery, and it's always full. As long as you don't call it a church service. There was communal singing at a brewery with an hour and a half of theological whatever and a food truck, right? But it was a ticketed event, so obviously it wasn't church. And then people wanted a gathering, so we started a beer bowl study, which is not a small group because it's at a tasting room. And we discussed the Bible. But like the idea of the things I did during that, I'm like, oh, I'm in North Carolina. Like, I know how to basically do this. No, it didn't like when I got Pete Rollins and Kessler Bruin, we all wore pirate costumes and everyone came to the event in costume. That like, I told some people that I was like, here, so let's try this. They're like, what? You're going to, I mean, I get if you want to have a beer and talk or something, but there was just this different vibe as opposed to the church council people are like, that's really cool. Like, we think you should go do these things. It took me a while to recognize there was this type of kind of freedom for creative expression, and it was celebrated. And then when you go back into it in the South, you're like, I miss Los Angeles, not just for the tacos.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting to sort of figure that out, because I've always found that Southern California was a warm place. Maybe because I grew up there, I always felt like there were people to get along with and to talk, and you could always chat. But I wouldn't call it an intellectual space. It's not one that people really want to investigate deep history or even go that far in terms of philosophy or anything else. I wouldn't consider it a deeply analytical place. Whereas I think that in the East and in the South, what you find is that people are very committed to particular kinds of things, and they want to follow those trails. The more familiar, the better. But the less familiar it is, the more suspect it becomes. And that suspicion leads you to sort of say, I'm not sure, who you are. And that barrier of familiarity or trust is a bit higher, I think. So if you fit in and you're in that groove, great. But if you're not, it may take a little more effort.
And it makes sense.
Maybe that's part of, a sort of a California vibe, which is something that people might say because of the mobility and things like that. And then you also have people who have come from other places, right? So you have multi-generational Asian, multi-generational Latinx from all kinds of different backgrounds. And those people were always sort of willing to kind of step into, this is kind of what we're doing here, and many of those people, at least when I did my work on Mosaic long ago, my first thought was, these are all people who they grew up in their parents' and grandparents' churches, but they don't want to stay there. So the ability to kind of move away from that and adopt sort of broader perspective, okay, I can be Christian, but I don't have to be Christian in this particular way, might also allow for greater openness. But I wouldn't say that that's true of everybody. And certainly you can find fundamentalism in California and in Los Angeles, and that sometimes can be very surprising, is to find a very strong fundamentalist in the middle of, everything else going on.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And they have and fundamentalists there have a different experience culturally than in the South, right? Because it's like you're doubly judged if you are vocally fundamentalist in Southern California than,
But I've seen them very proudly carrying those big leather Bibles, and they're preaching wherever they go.
Yeah.
It's exciting. So, I mean, and some of those people, honestly, I have found inspiring because they have carried through their convictions to the bitter bitter end. I just don't think that they're growing. There aren't that many of them, so they become a rarer and rarer breed. So finding themselves in their little churches, is where they can find, except when you come to something like a John MacArthur, which is very successful and sort of merges the capitalist-friendly Christianity with the fundamentalism. And that's also a pattern that you can easily find. And that creates its own reverberation of what a proper theology would be, what a proper way of doing church, what a proper Christianity is. And that can be surprising because you don't expect to find it, again, in Southern California. But you can find it there. And then there are enough people, and it's done in such a professional manner that it can grow and be huge, right? Thousands of people. And so it replicates an attitude that you can find in smaller churches throughout the South. But there it becomes a niche brand, right? And that's pretty fascinating.
So one of the things I'd love to hear is, what are the big questions that dominate a sociologist thinking religion? Like, what are the questions, if you hang out with at AAR and the sociologist of religion get in a room, like, what are the questions everyone has wrestled with because we've decided as sociologists of religion, these are important. We may not know what you end on, but as a field, like, you better have a reasonable answer to this because we're going to ask you.
Well, it's a great question. I'd say I'm not going to give you a quick answer, but we can go back and forth on this, because one of the things that I love about sociologists is sociologists are really curious people, and they're self-critical, right? They say, we've paid attention to this, but my God, aren't we tired of paying attention to this? And can't we move on to something else? So we've largely moved on from secularization, for example, and we have a lot of different ways of talking about this, but if anything, the sociologist of religion is going to say, look, it's not that religion matters less. It's that the structure of religion has changed. And being able to articulate that in different ways is part of our challenge, to popularize that, if you will, so people understand. But we don't think religion is gone. We think religion has shifted. And that puts us into seeing where religion actually lives, and seeing how that happens outside of church walls or things that are labeled religion. The work that I've done on Latino Protestants, for example, Latino Protestants don't necessarily have church buildings. They're meeting in homes and in rented facilities, and they don't have signs. And so even finding Latino Protestants, it's not hard to do, but it's not in the obvious place that you might think of. So being able to trace where it is, besides where you think you should expect to see it, is one of the most exciting things that I think sociologists of religion do. I think sociologists of religion are also, they're very meticulous at saying, people say this, but what are they actually doing? And so that mixture of the attitudes or how people talk about things versus what they actually show when they take the survey or when we observe them personally or when we talk to them is very exciting. And I think that the application of politics today is one of the most important. So if people say a lot of things about the relationship between themselves and God, or the way in which God should be enacted in government or things like that, well, you'd be surprised how often those things relate to measures of racism, measures of gender discrimination, and we can go on and on about this. They would not believe themselves to be racist. So this is one of the challenges, to say, look, there's a connection between the way in which you express how you understand America to be as a Christian nation, and the fact that you only accept that it's to be a nation for certain people and that it has privileges that work in particular ways. So some of the best sociology is really showing the ironies and the contradictions that exist, which doesn't make us a lot of friends. I don't have a lot of friends. And so we just find that we're constantly having to go, well, it doesn't quite work that way, or, well, let's look at it this way. So I think that that's important. Then I think that the other challenge that we have as sociologists of religion is that most of our work is centered on Christianity. I mean, I understand why, because it's mainstream religion. It's so much of what we see and experience, but we have a deliberate attempt to at least pay attention to what's happening with Islam in America, what's happening with and all forms of sort of like Hinduism, Buddhism, other sort of non-Christian orientations, and also trying to pay attention to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, who, even though they are within the Christian umbrella, don't get a lot of attention either. So we're really interested in making sure that we try to get at those things that aren't obvious. Then the other thing is there's a lot of attention on non-religion, irreligion, not just atheism, but all forms of religion that occupy spaces that people don't normally consider to be religious, and how those operate. And that is a huge array of studies. We used to say they are the nuns, the people who check none when it comes to religion. But we have a whole lot of other categories that we're working with. And it seems like almost every day somebody is publishing, writing on something related to this in some way, which I think matters to a lot of people as well. Those are a few things I think that would matter.
Oh, yeah. I think that's really helpful. And so when you get your students showing up for the first time in a sociology of religion class, whether they're religious or not, like, what are those kind of big ideas that kind of throw them off kilter, where they go, oh, this is what's going on, right? Like the first time they take a Bible class and you're like, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. And then people are like, what? Like there's so many, like each discipline that touches religion has like certain elements of it that are so foreign to how either the cultural detractor or the cultural participant thinks, that like once you start to get those, you go, if that turns you on, this is things you should start reading and paying attention to.
Well, I love big frameworks. So in my religion class, I usually spend 4 to 6 weeks on Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. So with Marx, I start with them knowing, of course, you've heard of Marx, but you probably don't know anything about what Marx said or what he actually is trying to
Well, he hates Jesus and America.
Right. And so we start with reading.
He doesn't
Marx.
like guns.
Well, and a close reading of Marx actually reveals things that they end up agreeing with and they think are really on point. And then we start to go see how it's really interesting, the kinds of things that he framed, including the idea that we don't believe things and become who we are. It is who we are that sort of shapes the ideas that we have. And that's, a little mind-blowing moment for a lot of students, and that they can build on. Then Durkheim, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, to me is very exciting. It's a lot of pages for the insights that you got to run across, right? But the insights that you get, are earth-shattering. And particularly, I love when he talks about the energizing power of religion and how there's hilarity and empowerment and energy, and how we as human beings dissipate when we move away from things. We're like leaky buckets, and all of the enthusiasm that we had all of a sudden goes away. And so to understand the power of collective ritual and the power of collective symbols is something that's really powerful. Once students get that, they just never forget it. And all of a sudden, all kinds of things start to be read through that lens. And then Weber, I focus on the Protestant ethic and sort of the idea of how is it that the framing of understanding of the uncertainty of whether we were saved or not, how do you know? Well, then you have to look at external characteristics of how we know. And so how we know is, look, like we're busy and we're doing things and things are happening. And because we're so moral and we don't waste our monies and everything, all of a sudden wealth grows. And so then how Weber brings us to this idea of unintended consequences, that the unintended consequences of the building of wealth that happened through the Protestant ethic created the system of capitalism, and that it's an ideational basis for understanding this giant thing that once the umbilical cord, allowed the baby to grow to a certain point, you no longer needed it. And so you could cut it off, and we stick with capitalism at the same time that we lose religion. You don't have to buy into the argument. It's just understanding that there's an argumentation here that gives you a heuristic approach to being able to say, okay, how is it that our beliefs that cannot be seen are manifested in behaviors, and how we only live in realities that we sort of cultivate for ourselves? This becomes reality because we enact it and it becomes real. So then because it becomes real, then what are the things that are larger, not just the way I live my life, how I dress, or who I get along with, but how it creates entire systems of politics and economics. That's a very exciting stuff. So by the time we're at week 5 or week 6, students have a huge grab bag already of tools that then we can start to apply in examining other aspects of social change and particular historical developments, and to help them kind of grasp on things, particularly when it comes to individualism or individualization, and some organizational structures of church and congregational life, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I want to sign up. That sounds like fun.
It's really cool stuff, It's really good stuff. And to give them better terms for understanding non-religion or irreligion. And I have students go out and I ask them to go to the least familiar place they can. Okay. So whatever you grew up with and whatever it is that you think I want you to go as far as you can. And so one student ended up in a private home in Charlotte where it was sort of like an imam, a sort of self-professed imam who'd created an electronic church where it only had like his wife and a couple of people in the actual room, and everyone else was online. And, she had an unforgettable experience, but she was able to filter all that. And people who go to the local Quaker center or who go over to the temple. And so the idea of, okay, this is normal to them. It's not normal for me, but it's normal to them. And to sort of get a grasp that there are people who are living religious lives that are utterly normal to them, even though you've never heard of it or can't imagine being there. And what's so striking is the first time students go, they're a little afraid. Can I take a friend? But the second time, no problem. So being able to cross over these sort of sacred lines and all of a sudden finding they're human beings, they're willing to talk to me. Like, this is something that I can actually understand and grasp. To me, that's also exciting. So then it begins to break us open so that we can pay attention to things and not be afraid just because it's unfamiliar to us.
No, that's really helpful. So one question that comes to mind, based on that is, so in philosophy of religion, there's always this shift from the part of the class where you have these really old questions, like the existence and attributes of God, the problem of evil, these type of things, which are all questions where, even though they're philosophers and don't say this, the background is like Anglophone omni-deity, right? So the only reason that all these questions are in the philosophy of religion curriculum is because the discipline was kind of invented by people that was their background, right? So then in philosophy of religion, there's this big shift with like Hume and Kant, where they're like, God, that's above our pay grade as philosophers. Like, we're going to bracket the question, come up with reasons we can't get to it and all that. But religion, that's a human endeavor, and we have to philosophize about it. And once that shift happens, then philosopher of religion is critiquing what essentially, when it's birthed, dominant culture, Christendom. And then over time, those tools that the kind of critique of religion you develop within early modernity and such, once culture is no longer dominant Christendom, the philosopher of religion realizes that what we learned from the prophets and reappropriated right to early modern Europe is now getting turned on a whole host of things like economics or politics, because what we were cultivating were strategies for revealing what was covered up in religion, or for highlighting what's been brought to the fore, having an agenda, all these type of things. I like, do you see, as a sociologist of a religion, something similar, that like the tools you cultivate in thinking through religion also become wonderful, powerful tools for thinking through other cultural and social structures like politics or the economy and such?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, most sociologists of religion are really sociologists of religion. And so For example, I'm a sociologist really of race and religion, and then more recently looking at power, but always concerned with social change and inequality. So those are things that have always cultivated. I have other friends who it's religion and gender, and others it's religion and. So that kind of thing always it adds a real excitement, because inevitably we have our feet in different pools of scholarly conversation. So that it's very hard to imagine just sociologists of religion in their own kind of world. Rather, it's sociologists of religion who are constantly seeing how religion operates in all of these other structures. And that's often our contribution, is there is a manifestation of the power or the force of religion. And of course, we look at different levels. We're looking at religion as an experience. How is it that my internal world or my subjectivity is shaped or oriented around religious ideas or beliefs? Then, of course, is the organizational level, things that are sort of either whether they're labeled religion or not. So is QAnon a religion, for example? Sociologists of religion would have a lot to say about QAnon, more on an organizational and sort of a flow of network kind of relationship. And then there's the macro historical connection. You cannot really make sense of the modern world without having some understanding of religion. Even if you choose to dismiss it, it's only because you really just decided you didn't care, right? Because you look at the history of colonialization, the invasion of the Americas, just to start with, you just want to start there, and you see that religion pervades the entire basis of what we see as the liberalism, the conservative liberalism, meaning the equality of rights for some people, but not for others, and the dismissing of rights of others, and the raising of capitalism and all that, all as being something that's shaped out of religious sensibilities. If you look at the fact that Black people were eventually baptized out of a controversy that emerged, should they be baptized, because we weren't sure if they had souls. And then if they did have souls and we baptized them, could we still enslave them? Can you still enslave a Christian brother or sister? Well, that was resolved pretty quickly in 1790 or so, where we said, yeah, we just make sure that they know that it's a spiritual salvation and that their freedom is spiritual. It's not real. And so then you have now the makings of what allows a religious legitimation of systems of inequality. So basically, I guess what I think is we're very fortunate that sociology really was born in the mid 1800s, if you will. That's kind of where we trace the origins. So we're right at the center of the kinds of things that we're trying to still figure out today. And if my students gain anything, they gain an appreciation that 200 years ago was really not that long ago, because we're still living with the force of all those things. And so anything we throw into the mix is helping them to make sense of the world in ways that they just don't get taught anywhere else. And so I'm actually a firm believer that sociology really has a distinctive contribution to make in understanding history and the flow of history. Of course, economics and the reality of economics, and of course, politics, more than just sort of decoding the Constitution, but really, how does power work and what happens? And then in terms of theology, we even have a foot in the door there with more theologians doing ethnographic work in order to do their theology. That's a very big thing that's going on. And I don't know of a theologian that doesn't care about people, the way the world works. Theology calls it anthropology, but essentially all of the theologians that I've read, all of them deal with the human experience in some way. And so I think sociology has something to contribute to even theologizing better, because we can get a better sense of the kinds of ways in which human experience and human interaction can be conceived of, right? So that's, I think it's pretty exciting stuff overall.
Oh, yeah. So now that just begs the question, like, what are a few theological ideas that if they just paid attention in their sociology class, they would get rid of? And are there any where you're like, when you hear it and you're like, man, I really hope that catches on?
Well, do you mean in terms of theology, what theologians are talking about?
Yeah, well, theological anthropology, is one of the, like, theologians have the desire to do a better job. But I mean, as someone who has spent the last couple of years going to lots of gatherings where theologians are trying to engage scientists, like, the heart could be willing, but the insights delayed. And so I wonder if because just even think of, you mentioned earlier about Max Weber and Protestant work ethic, and this type of, underneath that is a certain anthropology, right? A notion of depravity, and then you're going to signal, right, your election through what you do. Though it's not works righteousness, it's just evidence of your election.
That's right.
But it does lead to every good Protestant having a side hustle. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, but things like that, like if we paid more attention to the way a sociologist sees religion working and what it means to be a religious person in the present, are there things we would pay less attention to or things we pay more attention to?
Well, I think this is where it gets a little tricky, because theologians have invested a tremendous amount of time and energy in certain things. And they're not all the same, of course. There's an immense diversity among theologians, but some of them come into the theological work with already some commitments. If you're a Thomist, you're already committed to so many things that it's kind of hard to break out of that. So I think part of the difficulty that theologians, I think, struggle with is that they are trying to cultivate a consistent system of how to understand things. And in order to create sort of the ideational consistency, they may conveniently ignore a lot of things about how the world works. Okay. And it's much easier to look to the past than it is to look today. I've been reading about Bartolome de las Casas, right, who's the Dominican monk, the Dominican friar, who was argued that the indigenous peoples had rationality, and because they had rationality or reason, then they shouldn't be subjected to the kind of oppression that they had. But we also know that de las Casas did not have a full sense of wanting to include the indigenous in these conversations, that de las Casas was already applying a certain sense of what reason was to these people in arguing that they had it. And so he wanted to give these indigenous peoples the rights, but he didn't have a conversation with them about their rights, and that's the kind of thing that I think we see, is that there's a conversation that's happening internally without necessarily recognizing that there may be an experience or an actuality about how the world actually operates. So, for example, if we say that in the modern world, there is no totalizing entity, okay, we have many different social structures, we have many different social institutions, and they all compete with one another. They also strive to create moral universes in and of themselves, right? So Apple creates a moral universe within itself, and it extends even to its consumers about what's good, right, and beautiful, and the way in which we're supposed to live our lives. And then your local church comes in, and your local church also wants to create a moral universe that everybody lives in, and what's good, right, and beautiful within that. But I, as an individual, do not live either in Apple or at the church. And I have to constantly navigate all of the different moral systems that are coming at me, knowing that those moral systems are usually going to take more time and more effort to master and to figure out than I have time to just sit in my church. So every pastor knows this, if every theologian doesn't. And that is that human beings can't live within this one moral system and have it be consistent. And we have to actually figure those things out. So I think part of it is like, theologians want us to live ideational, consistent lives, including themselves. But when they actually, have to pick up their kids, or they have to attend the faculty meeting, or they have to go through TSA, or they have some kind of glitch and their computer breaks down, all of a sudden real life intrudes. And I think that none of that fits, or very little of that fits into their things. And so I'm not a fan of huge abstract categories like sin or the fall or depravity or things like that, because they just swallow up too much. They don't give us the finer grains of what we need to understand the actual circumstances of people and how to work through things, And so if we have inequality in America, or if we have racism in America, to talk about something more particular, if you will, it's not enough to just say, well, we live in a fallen world, of course we're going to have racism. No, we have a lot of concepts and issues that we've looked at to see, where did it come from? How does it originate? How does it perpetuate it? And what is operating in different ways? So we actually believe, as sociologists, that we can confront this. But we don't have enough theological partners who are willing to step into that kind of nitty-gritty and be able to provide the leverage to see how those changes could happen, not just in our ideas, but in terms of our churches and our colleges and schools and in our homes and neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's great. So, over lockdown, sometime in the summer, I've done a bunch of different reading groups, and I did one with Adam Clark. We were reading through a bunch of James Cone work, and there are about 2,500 people in the class. And I just, I think that's when, I don't remember what of yours it was that occasioned this, but I know it's in American Blindspot because I went back and looked. But one of the sections in the book, you spend some time, well, I mean, you picked the word blind spot for a reason, right? But the blind spot is connected to this mixture that goes on in people, where what is getting itself done in religion includes some really beautiful things. Like, I know some really kind and lovely people that are also the same animating faith in their tradition, also includes these blind spots where really ugly things happen that if you ask them if they thought it, they would just go, "That's ridiculous, Trip. Why would you say that?" And no, that's not what's going on. And I think one of the powerful things about your work there is it's not used to completely dismiss a group of people. It's not used to give a simple answer, right, of where did Trump come from? Oh, it's just some angry working class white people. But it becomes a way of unpacking different blind spots that are at the very heart of American religion. Right. So I wonder if you could kind of maybe tell it biographically about like when the election happened. And then you're going, just like every scholar was, like, huh? Right? Well, like, what was it like to then start wrestling with it and hearing real flippant or real shallow explanations, and then bring the resources of your scholarship to unpack it in such a powerful way?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would agree that 2016 and the election came as a surprise to me as it did to most everyone else. There are some people who say, I knew all along, but I was paying a lot of attention to the talking heads, the newspapers, blogs, Twitter, and everybody expected the election to go differently. Everybody. And so what we have to wrestle with is, what were we missing? Because whatever it was that Trump tapped into is not something that he created, right? I do not believe that he created something that somehow everybody was mesmerized and they fell over and they go, oh my gosh. No, it was something that was already there. So then the only decision to be made after that is, how far back do I go? Okay. Is it something that developed over the Obama presidency? Is it something that was maybe rooted back in the Reagan years? Because a lot of things go back to that. Is it something that goes back to the Scopes trial and the development of fundamentalism and its contention with popular culture and politics at that time? Well, wait a second. What about slave-holding Christianity? And wait a second. So I kept going back, and I spent a really concentrated 6 months, in addition to going ahead and putting a new class on the books at Davidson called Race, Class, and Donald Trump, right? So just to put it on the books that we're going to talk about this because we're trying to uncover this, and Donald Trump's presidency becomes an occasion for us to think about race and religion better, right? And what I learned, the most important thing that I learned is how much I didn't know. I mean, I am considered an educated person, right? And I read.
I imagine so. USC hopes so.
And I read a tremendous amount, and I make an effort. And I was shocked at how much I had never heard of, things that had never been introduced to me, things that I just should have learned in middle school that was just not a part of anything. So all of a sudden I started to go, okay, let's take a look at the framing of the Constitution, the earliest race relationships, the colonization efforts. Let's look at the forces that led or that tried to thwart against anti-slavery, and what did that look like? And what was religion's true role in that? Because, by the way, Christians were not pro-slavery. We're not anti-slavery. They were pro-slavery. By and large, almost everybody was pro-slavery. And so to think of Christianity as being the roots of where slavery was overcome is a terrible misreading of American history. And it's not hard to find. It's just you have to look, okay? The failure of the Reconstruction period, then all of the things that went into the framing of a brand new economic arrangement, whether you call it sort of a Keynesianism or welfare, and then the rise of neoliberalism, like all these things that was just tumbling together all at once. I had major aha moments every single day. Aha. Oh my gosh. Oh, look at this. Oh God. And it all started to come together. The problem is that I had to craft it. I had to dig it through. But it's not because the resources are not available. They are available. It's just nobody had taught it that way. The public school has no interest in that. There is so many threats. The church has no responsibility for that. So basically, I found myself reconceiving of how I understood the world. And as I was teaching, some of the best students in the country, Davidson College attracts, top 1% of students in the country when you measure it by GPA or standardized test scores. I don't mean to brag. They just happen to be very, very good students, and Davidson has a very long and distinguished history. And so what I found by stepping into a classroom with students who were the best students in America, they said, how come nobody ever told us this before? So we have the best students in America who are succeeding, who still don't know this. So I feel like we all need to learn a different American history. We all need to correct for the major blind spots that, in a sense, is my blind spot, but one that I found that many, many other people shared. And all of a sudden, that then started to rework all of the things that I had been learning and had tucked away in different places in my head about the way in which American religion operated, and the way in which my own spirituality was coordinated, the way in which I understood my participation in politics in various ways, the things that I supported or seen, and the messages that I was constantly being given. So it was a major thing that I now still continue today, because my readings have continued. And I'm now reading people like Enrique Dussel, Ethics of Liberation, or Walter Mignolo and all of his decolonization work, and Boaventura de Saur Santos, who's another amazing. So these are people who are now unpacking aspects of the dominance of power that has reshaped not only economics and politics, but religion as well. Maria Lugones, and then looking at some of the feminist thinkers again. It's like I'm just repositioning myself. And so as we know about paradigms, most of us have learned about paradigms, okay? Paradigms, as Kuhn described it, paradigm gave us the questions to ask and also gave us the answers for them, right? It's a package. And so what I have been doing deliberately is I have been trying to shake off a paradigm that had already pre-built the questions and the problems, and the solutions, and to then go, okay, if I look at it in other places, and Enrique Dussel says it in a very provocative way. He says, start with the victim. So start with the victim, start with the excluded, the marginalized, the outsider, looking at the real circumstances at their world. And what that does is it gives me a full rereading, reorientation towards the history of Western thought, towards the history of Western theology, okay, towards the history of our Western institutions. And all of that I have found to be tremendously fruitful. So you're catching me in a really interesting moment where I'm learning new things, I'm taking it all in, I'm seeing how that then will work, in particular, a Lilly-funded project that I have that is confronting racial injustice, white churches that are committed to addressing racial injustice, and it's more than just, a new diversity initiative. It's really attempting to go more radically at the roots of things. And I find that I need to rethink what my presumptions are about the whole thing in order to enter this one. And it's giving me new conversation partners It's giving me new excitement for, the things that I never knew, and tapping into like really vibrant voices that are out there. It's just really cool stuff, really exciting.
Oh yeah. What's amazing to me is how shocked Christians are that you should think things through, beginning with the experience of people on the margins, right? Like, you gather every week and you have like the Eucharist and there's crosses everywhere, and then you say to yourself, but my 401k. But it's one of those, like, I remember the first time I read John Sobrino, and he talks about how he's just dumbfounded by Americans trying to convince the rest of the world they're a Christian nation when they're the most efficient builder of crosses the world's ever seen. And he's just like, this is nuts, So one of the questions that a member in the Homebrewed community sent me when I said I was talking to you was like, are there a particular narrative or two that you found in your work around blind spots that would be important to lift up, or maybe a historical moment, so that we start to, that our congregations, either in worship, lifting up someone, right, as their biography or whatever, or telling stories, or in Christian education, so that they are then put in the network where you're thinking about your religious identity. Because I think that, and you mentioned this earlier about the way, how part of the way blind spots function, aren't these deliberate things? It's just they're like very effective, right? If religion helps you become a great citizen and a great entrepreneur or company man, or whatever, then excellent. But what if our desires are different than the market or our nation? Then we should probably change, the narratives that center us. So, like, are there particular things that shook up for you that go, the blind spot can't stay if this is on the table?
Yeah. I've got a good list of them, and it's growing. So I'll just share a few. Okay. Some of them got good attention in American Blind Spot. Some have come since then that I go, wow, this really would have been good to add a whole lot more. So first of all, I think that most people really do not understand about the colonization movement in the United States, and that early colonization movement is a history that I think unpacks a lot of things for people. In terms of abolitionism, Abby Kelly Foster and her husband, man, there is a fantastic biography of her life, and I loved it. I devoured that book, because what I found is that the abolitionist movement had all kinds of problems and issues related to it. And once I understand the things that Abby Kelly had to fight against in churches, where they would go and speak, and not only did they have eggs and stones thrown on them, there were times when her and her husband were actually picked up and thrown out of second floor windows because they just could not handle the kinds of things that they were talking about. I think that Abby Kelly and her husband, Stephen Foster, amazing people that would have you think differently. Of course, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass usually gets more of a quote than a study. And Frederick Douglass is worth a lot more time. And the literature that has come out has grown. But he is like James Baldwin, a person who really got to the roots of whiteness in American Christianity and was able to speak from it in a compelling way. So it takes effort on our part to sort of go, what did he already understand that somehow I don't? But he, like James Baldwin, he spoke from a place of deep understanding, so that he was able to be a person of faith, but utterly rejected the racialized Christianity that had done so much brutality and violence on him and people around him. I think that that's pretty critical stuff. I think that when you move into the 20th century, it's pretty fascinating stuff when you look at the connection. Go back to slavery. A book that I really enjoyed, if we're going to go and throw a few things out, There's a book by Luke Harlow called Religion, Race, and the Making of Confederate Kentucky, 1830 to 1880, okay? Published by Cambridge. I know Luke will be glad that I mentioned his book, but this book, more than any other, really helped me to understand the arguments that occurred between pro-slavery and anti-slavery Christians, and how both used the Bible to support their assertions and came to very different conclusions. And what I found is that it was the first time that I had clearly read the anti-slavery argument from the Bible, because I think I know the pro-slavery arguments a lot more, or the ones that I hear more. And that book really lays it out. It's not like a bigger, it's not a quick read or a beginner text. It is a clear text with the right kind of depth for us to understand something that requires that kind of energy. Then when you move into the 20th century and start to piece together, how is it that Christianity and evangelicalism super collided with one another, that pro-capitalist Christianity, man, that stuff is very powerful. And so I put my Schuller book, The Glass Church, in line with Kevin Kruse's book that also looks at Christian nationalism, more people know, and also Darren Dochuk's more recent book, Anointed with Oil. So those are things that are very, very powerful. So I think that maybe some of those things, but obviously is an incomplete list, right? There's so much more to really grapple with, because then I also think that we need to come to an appreciation of, and there's not one book that I could offer you, but we need to come to an appreciation of the way in which capital and financial markets started to operate in the 70s and 80s. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a real worry that inflation was out of control and we weren't going to afford things, and what are we going to do about debt and all that kind of stuff. And anytime I mention economics, my students go, "Oh, I don't like economics. I don't want that." Okay, I'm not talking about economics like the demand curve and equations. I'm talking about understanding the way in which money works. And when Reagan, and just before and then during the Reagan presidency, they really emphasized the free flow of credit. That free flow of credit went into the pockets of Christian capitalists who wanted to support certain kinds of businesses, and it went into the hands of megachurch pastors and the buildings they wanted to build. And when you start to understand the way in which credit and the new forms of credit emerged, now you start to understand the fact that we now invest more and more in a class of people who have investments, and that's different from people who earn a wage. We need to be able to make that distinction more clearly if we're going to approach issues of equity in the future. I think most Christians don't really understand that. And so being able to understand that, because when I go into a church, many churches today, they want to preach to people and they want to deal with the needs of the people, okay? And so inevitably the sermon is, I know things are hard, but God is with you, right? And I have been to many churches where that's essentially the only message they have. The assumption is, I'm doing terrible, and so I come here because I need God's help and that kind of encouragement in order to make it through my week. Okay, but as a sociologist, what I think that does is it does not understand the circumstances of my life and what is it that makes my life so terrible. Because the fact of the matter is that 90% of people in America cannot readily afford some kind of a medical emergency. If their car's transmission goes out, they wouldn't readily be able to just pay for that, right? And so when you say, "Oh, my car broke down, pray for me," or "I lost my job, pray for me," we really don't understand the gig economy. We don't understand the way in which wages have been suppressed. We don't understand the way in which shareholders are far more important than consumers or people on the front lines. And so we actually need to pivot our church leaders to understanding the circumstances of the world and to understand, okay, where does this pain come from? So if we just theologize it and say, God's here to address our pain, we're not really coming to terms with what actually has created the pain. And that's where I think our brethren in the Black church and other churches also really come to understand better, because they have no mystery to understand where does the pain of the Black experience in America come from. It's not just because there's sin, it's because of racist structures in the world that still operate today. And they don't have a problem naming it, addressing it, organizing for it, right? That's the kind of thing that I think that the Christian church should be understanding, is really saying, okay, where is the problem coming from? And then what can we do about it? Rather than just sort of this empty, trust God, clean up your resume, maybe we can connect you to somebody in the church who can help you get a job.
Oh,
that's
man.
not enough, is it, Trip? I don't know. Maybe.
No, it's not. It's not. I've been pitching an easy shift is that for American church history, the Black church is Orthodox and the white church has been heretical and is hopefully overcoming. And I think if you just shift it that way, right? But part of that is permission then to acknowledge a lot of the blind spots if you're going to the book title, but just the horribly ugly ideology that is internalized. When I moved back to the South after being in Los Angeles, and so my kids were Southern California kids, and we're visiting churches, and we go to visit Progressive Baptist Church, and 10 minutes into the service, my son, who's 9 then, leans over and goes, "Yeah, I can't go to church here." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "It's all white people. Could you you don't think God would be?" And I agree with him in principle, but I was Southern. I'm a Southern white dude. I didn't think about it. He brought it up to me, and I was like, "You're right." And it was one of those times where you realize how much the normal of the world you're thrown into just gets in you. And that hermeneutic is there, right? Yep. So you have to be deliberate at changing it. It doesn't just happen on accident. Part of our deliberacy as parents was, once we found out we were going to have children, we just didn't work at churches where you argued about gay people coming and caring about economics and the planet, right? But I do think that there is this okay, so right now the big class I'm currently running is 1,200 minutes. Well, I mean, probably half or over half are ministers, with your Grieger on the economic crisis and religion. And the interesting part are the people who, are progressive if you ask them answers to basic questions, right? But who have not thought about the way the system that really emerges right in the 70s going into the 80s that you brought up shaped us. And one of the books we're reading, I just finished it for tomorrow's recording, is Desire, Market, and Religion, Young Mo Sung. But he spends most of his time as a liberation theologian in Brazil, even though it's like an Asian liberation theologian then works in Brazil and brings together all these things. But one of the things he emphasized, connected to that example you gave of prayers, right? Where people are like, we know we need this, so we're going to work on getting what we need. I have preached at, 150 different churches. Those prayers are in every church that lets anyone pray. Even the ones where there's no one that needs anything in that church, if they're honest. And one of the things Sung talks about is the way in which neoliberalism, with the access to debt internalized in everyone, their identities now attached to the possession of things. So all of a sudden, what we call need just starts growing, right? So your wants then get labeled needs, which then justifies the growth of the debtors market, right? It's not just true in the middle class who are all leveraged. It's not just true in me and all my friends who have tons of student loans will never pay off because we were told go to the best schools is fine. But it's even true if you look at the international banking system where we export an invitation into the World Trade Organization or whatever. We help them set up banks, multinational companies come in. By the time you get done, the aristocracy in those countries are trying to get what they need, which is what we think we need. And the poor are pillaged and the planet's raped. Right. So I so think that's such an important thing to get. And the thing I'm worried about, and I wonder what you're thinking about it, is that part of the difficulty in responding to Trump was we literally ran someone who just didn't act like that wasn't a big problem, right? In order for Biden to barely win,
right,
we had to run somebody, not the person who at least raised these issues.
right.
And then we're told, and maybe I'm told as a progressive person, see, aren't you glad you white leftists got calmed down by the black church who trusted Biden? Right. And so I wonder how you unpack this, because I feel like the planet and the crucified people today need the countries of power and privilege to stop calling wants needs, to not expand predatory neoliberal capitalism. And yet the only thing we could manage post-Trump is what we got, which if the other option's 4 more Trump years, great. I mean, the guy got a lot of shots in people's arms. Wonderful. Hope I get to see my family soon. But if you're, as a sociologist, raising those issues and then looking at how blind does that blind spot have to be? If this is what we can manage, does that make sense? The way I'm putting it?
Yeah. Well, it's huge. You got me thinking along the lines of a book that I recently read called The Morals of the Market by Jessica White. And it's a fabulous book. I got a lot out of it, but one of the things that I got out of it is the profound assumptions of who's civilized and who isn't. And the belief that Christianity was an agent to civilize people, and the people who were promoting it weren't themselves Christian. They didn't necessarily have any devotion. They just believed that Christianity was the right kind of thing to get people morally in the right place, to kind of do what they needed to do, respect authority, have families, privatize things, and to be able to, give allegiance to the state. And that fundamental framework impacts everything. And I'm teaching a class on immigration. And so I've been most thinking about how it impacts our understanding of who gets to come into the United States and to what extent are they considered civilized or not. And the fact of the matter is the system that we put in place is what energize and motivates the global migration system, because there are certain places that are doing it right, and those are the places that are being rewarded financially, and those places that aren't quite doing it right or can't really come in place, or just taking their spot in the system, are incredibly impoverished. So what you're talking about in terms of impoverishment, as you said, happens at a global scale. Okay, already I'm talking far beyond where most people are thinking. Most people just I need to pick up, some toothpaste, and I got to get some milk at this, they are dealing with their everyday needs. And everyday needs, if we are unable to step away from that and attain better critical distance and better education, we're just not going to get there. And that's why what you're talking about to me is such an ambitious agenda. The ambitious agenda of overturning or reworking our entire educational system and having our churches rethink everything, which means we have to socialize the leaders of the church. And then, of course, they are subject to the critiques of people in the church going, what are you talking about? What this isn't what I came to church for. So the whole system tends to really create issues about all this. And so we do our part, but I do think that a little bit of better information here and there, a few critical pieces of leverage, and anti-racism is one point of leverage. It is a place where we kind of go, okay, look, if you start thinking about this, you'll find that some things just really don't work anymore. And you'll start to pay attention to things that might be better. And then that leads you in a track. But we're not talking about something that's going to happen in one conversation. It's not going to even happen in a year. It's going to be sustained attention because people have to climb their way out of the comforts of the presumptions of the world that they live in, and also be willing to step against everybody else in their world who hasn't made any of those moves.
Oh, yeah.
So,
No, I think that's really helpful. Like, I feel like I've been running a little experiment on the podcast because in lockdown, I was like, well, I can't travel and speak. As an extrovert, that's really, really problematic. So I started doing these online reading groups, and we did one with John Cobb where we read Process and Reality. Then I did one on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then we did one on Black theology. Diana Butler Bass and I did one the last part of the election, looking at American religious history and political stuff, kind of talking about stuff that happened each day, and doing the Tom Ward and I did one where we read each line of the creed, trying to state positively what we do with them as open relational type theologians, and doing the one with Jörg Rieger on kind of Christianity and socialism and such. Like, because of lockdown, there are a whole bunch of ministers that have been in all of them. Mm-hmm. So for the last year, most weeks, they've read something, and then we've hung out online for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then we're all in Facebook groups interacting, and quite a few of them, had intuitions you have or theological insights, because all of a sudden you have a community online in the time, they get honed and you get more confident, and then you start to articulate it and voice it, have come back and said very similar things. We're like, it wasn't like my convictions changed. I was more confident in them and more nuanced in putting it in ways I was, thought mattered. And just imagine being we decided to do a James Cone class, and then the summer happens, right? So we'd already planned it, right? It's just like it lined up. And so all these people are coming into this class, right? 2,600 people. And so many of them are ministers going like, I know we care about this, but clearly I wasn't listening well, right? Of these white ministers, and then they meet black minister friends in it, and they're like, it was like really wonderful. But I think that what you're getting at is so important, that like we're at this weird place where your mind can change, you can grow, but your conversations that you're having that shape you, because they happen in these digital spaces or social media spaces and things, then the people that go to your parish may not be in the same place. And then it feels like this giant alienating tear. And so congregations, especially their leaders, are stuck with that, how do I negotiate the prophet priest role, kind of thing, or whatever.
Well,
but yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm very confident from the experience that I've had with my students, that if we just have a place where we can all be exposed to the same reading, and we can all allow ourselves permission to experiment with how to describe and explain what we're coming to learn, it's amazing how within 2 weeks, they spill out the most intriguing and important insights, and they are not controversial at all. That's what I find fascinating, because they very quickly come to accept things as just, yes, of course this is true, right? Whereas on Twitter or Facebook or something, people go, what are you doing? They kind of freak out. But I have found that having relational, open community, we don't have to be best friends and hang out all the time. That's not the point. It's the idea that we're going to spend close time reading. I don't care about your opinions, and this isn't the occasion for me to give mine. So that's not what we're going to do. But what we are going to do is we're going to try to understand what this person wrote, give them the benefit of the doubt. And if you give them the benefit of the doubt, what starts to come into view? And that is the energizing and transformative experience that I have had for years as a college professor. When I've had the opportunity to do it in ministry, same thing. It's just that the patience for being able to get out of your own familiar way of thinking about things and to step away from the TV or away from, that's what I think is the critical move. But if you are responsible to a group of people to saying, okay, I can't just think whatever I want. We're all responsible to what's going on here. Then I find that there is a growing and energizing sense of we can understand things better, that highlight things that we had never considered before, and that give a more satisfying understanding of how the world works. It's more sophisticated, but it's more satisfying because it's like, oh my gosh, yeah. Now you're not just fighting over a point, or you're not just saying, You're actually trying to go, okay, how do all these different things fit together? And they do. So I think we can all be much better about that. And I do think it works. And it's been very exciting to be a part of that work for a very long time now.
Do you think that, I had that experience when you teach undergrads, and also as a minister, when I was a campus minister or working with teenagers. Do you think that there's more at stake, right, for their parents and grandparents in ways that make those type of experiences harder? Because I've often thought one of the sad parts of denominations or churches going into survival mode is that they underfund the support to a generation or two out's theological imagination being rich. And just an example, like in North Carolina, the Baptists that like gay people on the planet stop funding campus ministry. Well, I'm telling you, most Baptists just go to campus are not. They're just like, well, they're Baptists, so that's us, right? Well, if the campus ministers go from me or people that I was friends with to some fundamentalist, that's not good. But I understand the budgetary reasons and that kind of thing. But as someone who's worked with people in careers, their identity and their vocation stuff is so tied. All the way down. Like, I've had major investment bankers at my church when I make certain comments that then when they're unpacked, I had someone say, I don't care what the effects of this is because this is my job and I'm paid to do it well. Right. Sometimes it's not until people retire again and they've opted out, right, of whatever the benefit structure for our vampire system on the planet that they can hear it. Like, do you think that, as a sociologist, those are just my intuitions, but as a sociologist, are there ways that if you're on the take, your imagination shuts down?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had the good fortune of working with adults like my entire life. So even when I was a young adult or I was a kid, I was still working with adults and trying to think through and process different kinds of things. I don't think the problem is money. I'm not even sure that it's just social placement. I think it's the lack of one key theological virtue, one key Christian virtue, and that is humility. Humility is the willingness to just say, you know what, I don't know everything. So the biggest difference that I find between a 21-year-old in college and a 30-year-old is that the 30-year-old has lived enough of an adult life going about whatever they do that it's worked well enough that they just feel no need to question it. If that's true of a 30-year-old, imagine the 40, 50, and 60-year-old. And so it's the sense that you have the opportunity to kind of make it well enough. And so at that point, everything just becomes pragmatics, right? I'm just pragmatically figuring out how to pay the next bill, how to get my kid into school, how to make sure I look right, the aesthetics of the entrepreneurialism that we all have to have, it seems like today, to forward ourselves as, that new market, enterprise person building a clientele. But in working with adults, every time I have had the good fortune of working with adults, and for several years I've been working with an anti-racist organization here in the Lake Norman area of North Carolina called Brownicity. You can find out more about that, brownicity.com, but it is an online resource for anti-racist curriculum. And the things that we have done is we have gathered with people, and we gather them for a few weeks at a time, and we ask them to read some things, we ask them to watch some things. But we also say, you can't talk. So for the first 2 or 3 weeks, they're not allowed to talk, because the assumption, which is the same that I do with my students, is I say, look, you don't know enough yet. So let's just put a few things under your belt first, and then let's talk, right? Because the first impulse is to kind of make sense out of the few shelves that you've already built in your mind, right? We've have so many shelves and everything's kind of placed, but I've got to get you to a place where you realize your shelves aren't enough, or there are other rooms in the house you've never explored before, right? And once people are willing to make that effort and not feel that I'm judging them and not feel like their whole world is crumbled or whatever, then all of a sudden it becomes really fun and very exciting. And that's the point that we're getting to. So some of the anti-racist work that I've done with people is people just with a new discovery of, oh my gosh, I didn't know immigration worked that way. I never heard of that before. Oh my gosh, I didn't know. And those kind of oh my goshes have resulted in a sense of being willing to then on their own find those other resources, teach their kids differently, engage with their neighbors in different ways. That's what's been fun. So I think that the issue is really one of humility. And the best I can, I've just tried to say, well, I realize, but it might be important for you to know that there are other things that you may not be aware of. And I understand, because I wasn't taught it either. So, how do we approach this instead of you have to, so I hear that prophetic call, but I wonder if we can embrace a prophetic call that really lures people into something rather than just hits them over the head with your convictions that you were fortunate enough to be formed because somebody was kind to you in your earlier life, right? Most of us need patience to kind of work through things and the ability to make mistakes and say things wrong, and if we can do that, I think that we can pull a lot more people along than we have. That's what I think.
Oh, that's awesome. Now that makes me more optimistic, Gerardo. So, do you think? Well, I was thinking of the difference between what you're describing and then when I have friends that I think are like starting to open up to ask bigger questions, and then they're forced by their whatever their employment system is to go to some training that then doesn't help. If your goal was to get that, like if they'd called me and said, Tripp, look, we know you're friends with, I'm not going to say someone's real name, Kyle. This is not my real friend. It's anyone, but Kyle, like we're doing anti-racism training. Like, is this going to be good? I would say, well, I'm not sure, knowing who's doing this, that it's going to be a positive experience if you're hoping Kyle's less racist in 3 years. Now, I don't know if this is true. I just know I've had friends that respond where I'm sitting there going like, oh no, I get the call because they're like, Tripp's my liberal friend. And they call me after they went to this thing. And I don't even know if what they're describing is accurate or not, because I assume they have the hermeneutic of unexamined white supremacy operating at high tilt. But nonetheless, like that's not, I really think I have something to gain here, and I'm participating, and I'm just listening for a while because I have to get things filled in different ways. Like I wonder if there's if it wouldn't be better to valorize people that cultivate humility and then give them the gifts rather than using those type of structural coercions, because like you even used, and makes a process thinker happy, lure them into, is very different than coercion. Coercion is usually connected to a failure to create a community and habits of virtue.
Yeah. Well, now I think we're talking about pedagogy. And I was very fortunate a long time ago now to be introduced to critical pedagogy, which may seem too technical for most people, but a lot of people have heard of Parker Palmer and his book, Courage to Teach. There's another fabulous book by David Kolbe, Kolbe, on the cycle of learning. And there are others, Ira Shore, someone that I've learned a lot from. But I guess there's a sense in which you can learn a lot of this thing in a lot of different ways. So yes, I can take courses or hear speeches or have somebody who just says, look, we're all racist and you all have to deal with it and come to church. I don't think that's the kind of learning that I'm talking about. The things that you and I have been talking about have been those things that provoke us to see things that had been previously unseen. It's like if we pull on our phenomenological friends and we say whatever reality is much bigger, vaster, it's utterly unfathomable. We can't really get at reality. So we do the best we can to sort of get some aspect of it as best we can. And out of that, we're trying to understand, okay, sociologist says, not only do we do that, Kant, Husserl, thank you very much. Even Heidegger you could throw in there. The point is that most of us are given preset the tools for how to grasp reality. And if they work well enough, especially if we're in a relatively closed community or we keep our networks within a particular thing, the tools that we've been given just seem fine. So then we go, that must be true because it's worked fine and it's familiar. But the phenomenologists remind us that really it's that these are things that have been given to us. And therefore, when we make sense of the reality that we can grasp, we have to, at some point, achieve critical distance, which I think is what Schutz pulls from in the phenomenological circles for sociologists, Berger and Luckman in another way. But we have to kind of take that critical distance and say, okay, the way it makes sense to me isn't necessarily the way it actually works. And so how do we begin that process? So the initial epistemic break has to be the way I have always perceived truth and reality is not the only way of doing it. And once that opens up, okay, Max Weber said, reality and its irrational, whatever reality is unfathomable. It's inexhaustible, right? It's something that we can't actually get at. If we can respect reality for the awesomeness that it is, which we usually attribute to God theologically. We say God is more awesome than we can comprehend. Okay, but God created a reality, if we want to go that route, that is also unfathomable fully, which is the mistake I think that many theological schemes have made, is that they believe that they can somehow, or even if you say, just read the Bible and all of reality is that. So if I can master those books, then all of a sudden I've mastered reality. That is the height of hubris, right? So we need to step back. And I think that is where once we accept we don't see everything and life changes and there are new innovative structures in terms of power that have come about, then I think we have to enter in and do different kinds of things. I think that's the kind of thing that Bonhoeffer was after in his last writings. Mm-hmm. He was just getting there. And had he lived longer, he would have helped us even more. But Bonhoeffer is a great example of someone who was willing to step out of his unfamiliarity and question that, and then be willing to look at it. And of course, the trauma of experience must have contributed to that. But even when he was in Harlem, obviously, he was willing to participate in systems that were unfamiliar to himself and allow his German self to be able to say, you know what, there may be another way of grasping the way the world is. So I think that those are the kinds of things that I think are helpful. We have to go a step further, but I also think I am presuming that we are approaching this process of achieving critical distance in a relational manner in a particular way. And we're doing it the best we can.
Okay, so I have 3 questions I want to ask and let you say whatever you want to. And I'm bracketing all of them related to your work on the emerging church movement, and I was inundated with questions related to that. We'll just have to talk again because I've had way too much fun. I got distracted, and I'm not going to try to shoehorn that in.
Let's do it. That's fine. Another time.
Yeah. So there are 3 questions. You can say whatever you want to say or not. If you were asked, what is religion? And the person has you say you're sitting at a table or you're at a bar and they find out what you do and they're like, yeah, so what exactly is religion? How how's Gerardo going to try to define that with the inheritance of all your experience and wisdom?
Wow. Well, I'd give you two slightly different answers. The first is I'm very fortunate to participate in a world of scholarship that's cross-disciplinary. And for some of these, this particular question is extremely important to try to get at the essence of religion or what religion is or things like that. And some sociologists have fallen into that. And clearly the way Marx would approach religion and the way Durkheim would approach, for example, would be very different from one another. So I think that for those that really care about this question, I don't think that they would come to a singular way of doing it or saying it. And I think that if they do, they would immediately alienate so many others who would approach it differently. So that's a pretty tricky academic-y kind of question. The second answer that I would give very quickly is, as a sociologist, whatever religion is something that human beings are doing something with and about. And so for me, because sociology tries to be respectful of empirical reality that is in some way measurable, and I think that all of us are stuck with that, by the way. I think that we all have to base our things on something as some form of evidence, even if you say it's the scripture becomes the evidence of that. Otherwise, we're in utter speculation or the realm of pure logic. I would say religion becomes almost anything that is really interesting in how human beings make sense of their world, as well as organize around it, as well as has impact in these macro and micro structures of the world. And so I'm perfectly willing to accept a very expansive understanding because I don't want to define it by a particular creed, organization, network, or history of any sort. Mm-hmm. That's about as terrible an answer I've got, but that's what it is.
Okay. So the second question, you talk about the relationship of race and class and religion in American Blindspot. It's one of the big debates in progressive circles is whether or not arguments around identity politics end up enabling the continued elitification, right, of the Democratic Party and the alienation of class struggle from, what animates it. If you are somebody who, and there's a lot of homebrewed people in this category who are very down to champion the inclusion and accommodation of anyone's their own testimony about their identity and practices of welcome, but also the class issue is a real big deal, or the way kind of neoliberal capitalism is shaping things needs to be addressed. And a whole lot of our country kin are turned off over that issue. Thinking the network of American religion, do you have wisdom for people who want to advocate for inclusion, but also articulate a vision where the working class poor in areas that are not, humanities degrees, concentration of people with humanities degrees, that you can organize in ways to deal with the class thing? Because one experience, I've had this a lot of times where even the inclusion thing becomes a means to not address systemic inequality in your city in Los Angeles, right? I worked at Palos Verdes Estates. I mean, you know what that represents. Mm-hmm. And we would include anything other than the redistribution of wealth. Mm. So how do you see those two playing out, especially for people that want to advocate greater inclusion and addressing the growing, inequality?
Well, I think that, of course, this is really broad, and there's no way I could really answer this in a satisfying way. But I do think that most of us can be a lot smarter about where to put our attention. So I think that when you actually take a step back and try to weigh everything of what's going on, we come to understand that privileges and opportunities are not equally dispersed. We know that there are certain blockages, some of them absolutely intentional, and some of them so baked in that people do not see where the intentions come from, but resonate with those. That we can be smarter about where we should be focusing our attention. And so there are so many different forms of inequality, and it is spread out in so many different ways. But I think that still we would say that some people really do have it so much worse off for lots of different reasons. And there are certain identities that are so much more marginalized. And there are certain things that are just so much more misunderstood. That if we don't do that, then we fall into the danger that many white evangelicals have of feeling like there's a certain persecution that I'm subject to, or the one that I pay attention to. And so this is the one that matters the most, and ignore the way in which power operates. So I think what we need to throw in here are dynamics of power, and to be able to somehow come to a better assessment of how power is operating and where the strategic moments are here. That's my thought at the moment.
Mm-hmm. No, and I do think that kind of the dynamics of power and thinking contextually is helpful. And it's weird how I thought about it as a congregational minister is different than thinking about it as someone with a public platform on the internet. And sometimes I'm not the most strategic at thinking about things like that. I was like, I started the podcast to talk to people at books I like, Yeah. But over time I try to be more intentional. But at one of the theology beer camps before COVID, and those are like 99 people. I only sell 99 tickets because it's very interactive and you all hang out with people and stuff. And then I'll bring 4 or 5 theologians that have been on the podcast there. And then the 99 people, and you hang out, and there's like small groups, discussion groups, main sessions. And then the other half's like youth group events. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's not that, but like you get loaded and do group karaoke and things like that. Well, I've had a number of people who listen to the podcast and not till they go to beer camp and then hang out with people that represent, like last time we did one in Nashville, I had 2 people separately, not friends, email me and say, I've actually never hung out with someone I knew was transgender before. And Robin Henderson Espinosa's there. They're on the podcast all the time. We're really good friends. Opening night, anytime Robin's at beer camp, we do a high quality Melissa Etheridge duet together. And somehow, right, like if you're a theology nerd, surely people are going to go to this. And then you have karaoke, and everything you think about the transgender issue and all that kind of stuff turns into Tripp's friend, who also has a love for craft beer theology, and you just sing karaoke. It changes. And I've had people email me after, and I keep thinking, like we just need to have so much of how we process things, because we have a smartphone, like cuts out all the human part. Like every Trump fan that I'm friends with. It's just all the ones I'm not friends with, I have sweeping dismissal judgments about. And I know that's problematic. You know what I mean? It's like, I wonder if there's, I don't know. Do you think that those type of transition points are sitting there for lots of people, where if they just had the opportunity together in the right space, there are a lot of doors towards beauty they could walk through rather easily?
Well, absolutely, you're right. Okay. But at the same time that I'm willing to talk about the unfathomable nature of reality, we also have to admit that we as human beings have limitations. Mm-hmm. There are only so many things that I can pursue depth on. There are only so many things that I'm going to be able to really grasp. And there are only and I'm going to gravitate to those things that have more connections to my identity in some way. So for example, I have spent time looking at post-colonial theory, okay, which is really based more out of trying to get rid of the English and other things like that. So it's India and other places like that, Orientalism. But I have been resonating more deeply with the decolonial literature that comes from the Latin American voices. And it has to be because somehow that makes more sense of my family experience. That's my tentative conclusion. And so is it okay for me to pursue a greater sense of liberation ethics, focusing more on Latin American voices than on the voices from the subcontinent of India or even from the African voices? I think it's okay. Why? Because I'm already reading thousands of pages. I know I read more than most people. It's like I just can't do it all. But if I feel like I get to a place where I think I've got a better stance for being able to promote justice and to do so in a way where I'm not just mimicking slogans, and just being cliche, but really like it comes out of a shaping of a conviction, then I think I'm doing okay. So I hear you. And I think instead of my trying to say, look, you have to pay attention to the justice issue the way I pay attention to it, I think instead part of what I learned from these people, including Dussel and including Santos, is that they are saying there are so many different places where inequality and injustice operates that we need not one grand epistemology of liberation. We need to allow space for multiple epistemologies of injustice, because all of those things are required in order for us to deal with things happening in different places. At least that's where I'm coming to today, because otherwise we only replicate having a totalizing perspective. It's just now we think that this is for the right reasons instead of the wrong reasons. But we may be just as coercive and insisting that people come into our way of thinking, which we think is the right way of thinking. I'm just not there. I don't think I've ever been there. I think that a long time ago, from some of the people that I've mentioned, I think we just need to get people started on the right kind of journey to do the right kind of thing. And to say, look, there was Peter and Paul, and they had different things, they had different emphases, they were doing different things, but they both were people who were committed, I think, ultimately to the right kinds of things. And the women with Jesus, and we can mention others who didn't have the writings, right? They are still there, and they did amazing things. Let's do that.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so the last question is, I'm interested as a sociologist what you would make of people that listen to this podcast. So, I mean, it's over 13 years old now. And the idea that 50,000 people are going to listen to this conversation is mind-numbing. And there's a huge mix. So there's like, I'm a congregational minister and I'm a nerd. Then there's like I grew up religious maybe, and I'm working things out, so you help. Then there's like my partner goes to this church. I hate the sermon, so I listen to you during the sermon. And then we got hate listeners. Those they're very fervent. They let me know until I mute them on Twitter. What do you make of that? Like, there's not like another part of like point in church history where, like if we went to the same church, right, we'd probably have a small group, and they would realize that there are two super nerds in their group. And so while they're drinking their first beer at pub night, they're like, Trip, Gerardo, y'all talk about whatever you want. We're just going to listen. Right. Then we'll do talking. This is how they're like all nerdy extroverts. Then they'll start talking, and slowly it will resort to local sports, politics, family stories, and we're all done. But instead, some people are doing dishes right now. Some are on the treadmill or stuck in traffic. And yet they're inserting two scholars talking about their disciplines, how they understand faith in the moment. And they're all these different places. Like, what do you make of that? And do you have unsolicited advice you'd like to give me to use the opportunity for doing this in, more strategic, life-giving ways?
Well, I think you've already succeeded in that, so you certainly don't need my advice. I think you've come at a really interesting place. First of all, of course, we diversified channels on which we could hear things. We could hear the absolute familiar. We could hear apparently the best of the best in terms of preaching and other kind of places. So we have a marketplace of being able to hear a lot of voices. But I think the space that you've tried to occupy is one that is willing to sort of work within the general bounds of orthodoxy, and they're pretty generous bounds of orthodoxy, but not.
I like generosity and humility, Gerardo.
Right? But not dogmatic. And so I think that what people get is an exploration of the Christian faith that tries to deal with more contemporary systems of knowledge, and yet be able to admit, like, I know where I came from. I know where most of you came from. Most of us have only thought about things and only had the opportunity to think about things in a particular way. So here's a chance in a chatty way for us to kind of get out there, because the other thing that you do is you don't insist that people see the world as you do. Now, I think you have your own convictions, of course, but it's always seems like you're on the move. You've been somewhere, you're here now, you're going somewhere else. And that sense of being on the move adds a dynamism to it that I think welcomes other people to say, okay, maybe I'm willing to be on the move too. I'm not even sure where to start. And that sense of being able to enter into a dialogue as a third person, even if you're a listener, still allows me to participate in something that feels very vibrant, very, very much in action. And so being on the ground, working with things, and kind of attuned that this happened today and didn't happen like 50 years ago, I think is something that is still pretty special when it comes to Christian conversations. Because basically, I remember once, if I could tell you a little story, I remember once I went to this place called the Bible Store. I think it was called the Bible Store in Fullerton. Have you ever remember this place?
In Fullerton, a store that's just for Bibles?
Yeah, that's all. They used to only sell Bibles, and you've never seen so many shelves. That's all they did was just sell Bibles.
And did they have all the translations or just the evangelical friendly ones?
That they could find. Of course, they had bigger selections of the New American Standard and King James, which of course were the ones that they thought were the best ones. And they slowly expanded to a few things like Chick tracts and Christian greeting cards and a few other things. But the Bible book, so I remember going in there because I used to go in there a lot. And a guy comes in and he goes straight to this little section that had 18th and 19th century authors. Okay, it's like Oswald Chambers and some prayer books and things. And the guy was Latino, and he goes, stick with the old voices, And I thought it was really interesting because basically he didn't trust anybody who was contemporary. It was only to work through these well-articulated, highly romanticized, and slightly flowery language that he defined as true Christianity. Okay. Well, I think that a lot of people, a lot of sermons, a lot of preachers, a lot of art, basically, they have framed what they understand to be true Christianity, and they don't move from that. It's the only thing you get. And so once you get it, whatever that may be, all you're doing is you're hearing the same sermon over and over again, the same message over and over again. I am willing to say, and they don't deal with what's happening today, because whatever's happening at the moment is obviously something that's not good, because it has gone against the thing that they already established as right and good in whatever their nostalgic spot is. Now, this nostalgic spot could have been in the 70s, could have been in the 40s, or it could have been in the 1840s. But nevertheless, there's a nostalgic center from which true Christianity comes from. I think that you are a person that says, look, I'm not sure that we could ultimately get at what true Christianity is. That's the impression that I get, because it's like so difficult. But I'm willing to try. And if we're going to try it, then we have to kind of work with some different ideas. And we also have to make it matter for whatever we're dealing with at the moment. And that in and of itself, I think, gives it a freshness that I think is important. So I don't have any recommendation other than keep doing what you're doing, which is, intellectual rigor enough, but also willing to accept that social change happens and matters. And that if faith is going to mean anything, it has to matter for how it deals with my life right now.
Yeah, well, your life's the only place you get to decide if you're a disciple or not. So, though, and if we're going to stick with an old version, definitely not Geneva. That's one of my prejudices theologically. But I've had a lot of fun hanging out, Gerardo.
Good to be here.
And we'll have to do it again to talk about all the emerging church stuff. And